Good evening. Welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. On the programme tonight, a US intelligence report warns of the possibility of armed confrontation between India and China on a day when the visiting Australian Prime Minister says India is a top-tier strategic ally. The common concern is, of course, China. The Australian Prime Minister was on the indigenous aircraft carrier Vikrant. We'll bring you a detailed explainer and debate. And at half past the hour, the Kochi toxic fire may more or less be out. But what are the consequences of this massive fire at a garbage dump that's taken a week to more or less put out? Were the fumes carcinogenic? If so, at what levels? Does anyone know or does anyone care? But first, the visit of the Australian Prime Minister. He was in India with Prime Minister Modi watching the test match at Ahmedabad, but later he visited India's aircraft carrier. Why is this significant and why will China be looking closely at this visit? This may look like a photo opportunity, but there's a lot more in this visit to INS Vikrant by the visiting Australian Prime Minister. The clearest ever sign of the strategic alignment between New Delhi and Canberra. The common concern is China, and Mr. Albanese made it clear that India lies at the heart of Australia's approach to the Indo-Pacific and beyond. What's more, India is a top-tier security partner, and the Indian Ocean is central to both the country's security and prosperity.
And there has never been a point in both of our countries' histories where we've had such a strong strategic alignment, and we share an unwavering commitment to upholding the rules-based international order and ensuring the Indo-Pacific is open, inclusive and prosperous.
The visit of Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, comes at a time when the US intelligence community, in a report to the US Congress, has spelled out that the situation between India and China, two armed nuclear neighbors, could be a potential flashpoint. The report says the expanded military postures by both India and China along the disputed border elevate the risk of armed confrontation between two nuclear powers that might involve direct threats to US persons and interests and calls for US intervention. While the nature of US intervention is not spelled out and it's unclear if New Delhi would accept any, Australia shares concerns on China's growing military presence in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific area. This is an area of common concern for both nations. In fact, for the first time ever, Australia will host the high-profile Malabar naval exercises with India, the US and Japan as partner nations off the coast of Perth in August this year. Australia is also now in the process of stepping up its own naval defenses by acquiring up to 5 nuclear-powered attack submarines from the US. It's the first time ever that the US is exporting nuclear-powered submarines. Australia will retain 100% control over the use of these subs, a key guarantee that Canberra pushed for. The Virginia-class submarines being acquired are at the cutting edge of America's submarine arsenal. Mr. Albanese's visit to India comes a week before the arrival of the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to India, another key strategic partner of New Delhi, and also a key partner in the Quad process. What is the Quad? It is the grouping composed of India, Japan, Australia and the United States, whose foreign ministers met here just last week at the end of the meeting of foreign ministers of G20 nations. So what exactly are the US, Japan, Australia and India concerned about? Here are some details. In 2025, 2 years later, China, which already has the world's largest navy, will operate 440 warships. In 2030, 5 years after that, the US Navy, the world's preeminent navy since the end of the Second World War, will operate 291 warships. That's a whopping 149 warships less than China. A recent US report to Congress has expressed concerns, in fact alarm, regarding the pace of China's shipbuilding effort. For India, this Chinese naval base in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa is a huge concern. We've got images over there. It is China's first overseas naval base, and as these satellite images show, China has already begun deploying their warships in this area. Well, joining us now to look at the nature of the threat that China poses, the important relationship that India and Australia now actually enjoy. We're joined by Alexei Mureviev. He's an associate professor of national security and strategic studies at Curtin University in Perth. Professor Mureviev, thanks very much for being with us. We're also joined by Andrew Lung. He's a China strategist. Brahma Chelani is with us over here in New Delhi, and also India's former ambassador Manju Seth. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. Mr. Muraviev, let me come to you first. Just in terms of the threat that China faces at this juncture with regard to India, is it your belief that China and India face a potential confrontation?
Well, I would probably describe it as a rivalry. I mean, using the word confrontation presupposes a degree of imminence of an armed collision. Clearly, India and China share a troubled history going back to the times of the 1962 border war. Then, obviously, more recently, we've seen border clashes back in 2020 along the disputed area in Kashmir. That in itself represents a problem. Sino-Pak relations obviously is something that I believe is of strategic concern to New Delhi, especially after Pakistan developed and acquired nuclear weapons capability. And as a report that you refer to suggests, China is obviously projecting a blue water naval capability with a clear intent of establishing permanent naval presence in the Indian Ocean, which obviously would be of great concern to New Delhi. Having said all of that, I also want to highlight that at this point in time, we should treat China expansionism with a degree of caution, not to say that we should undermine the significance of Chinese successes in capability development and technology development, but say, contrary to India and some other countries, China severely lacks operational combat experience. If we're talking about possible combat deployment of the Chinese military, I think the Indian military has much greater operational experience in fighting various level contingencies, regional wars, etc., etc. China doesn't lack it. China doesn't have it. The last time China saw serious military action was back in 1979 against Vietnam, and the Chinese have lost. So I think whilst it's important to keep a close eye on what the Chinese are doing and trying to understand and read the intent, we also need to not oversell the threat of China and its capacity to deploy capability, because as the war in Ukraine shows, you can have wonderful large-scale military exercises, you can have lavish military parades, but your military can only be proven combat-worthy when it comes to actual battlefield conditions.
And I just wanted to bring in Dr. Brahma Chelani as well. Dr. Chelani, is that a view that you share, or do you believe that China's aggressive military moves, certainly in the Indian Ocean region, let's talk about that, is a clear indicator that they're already here and they are here to stay? What are the implications of that?
China has pursued its expansionism not through overt conflict, but by stealth. Three elements define China's expansionism: stealth, deception, and surprise. Even the land grabs in India's Ladakh happen by stealth. It avoids direct combat. So the big challenge for India, for Japan, and for Australia, and for other countries that are facing Chinese expansionism is how to thwart China's aggression below the threshold of armed conflict, the way China pursues its aggression. It pursues it below the threshold of armed conflict. That's a big challenge, because the militaries in India, the US, and elsewhere are geared to fight in a combat condition. They're not trained to engage in aggression in peacetime by pursuing deception, stealth, and surprise. So it requires retraining the militaries to deal with Chinese expansionism. But I think the main point that the US threat assessment makes is not in relation to India and China. In fact, it's only a small paragraph on India and China where this threat assessment confuses the cause and effect.
Yep.
It actually says that relations will remain strained between these two countries in the wake of the lethal clash in 2020.
Yep.
The lethal clash in 2020 happened as a consequence of China's land grabs in India's Ladakh. I think the main point that this report makes in relation to China is that China is seeking to become the preeminent power globally by supplanting the United States, and it's pursuing the goal of weakening U.S. power and influence, including by building a growing partnership with Russia.
Yeah.
The China-Russia axis against the U.S. is the big change on the global geopolitical landscape, which has major implications for America's present global preeminence.
All right. Ambassador Seth, let me come to you next. You know, this statement by the U.S. intelligence community in this report, which is going to the U.S. Congress, says the expanded military postures by both India and China along the disputed border elevate the risk of armed confrontation between two nuclear powers that might involve direct threats to U.S. persons and interests, and calls for U.S. intervention. Is that at all acceptable to New Delhi?
I don't think so. It will not be acceptable at all because this would be a kind of interference unless Delhi asks for their help, which is unlikely. It's not a very positive statement that they are saying that, U.S. may need to intervene. And I don't think U.S. is going to intervene unless they are directly threatened. It is very unlikely, in my view, that the U.S. will send boots on the ground in a conflict between India and China.
I would suggest, Ambassador, that U.S. Intervention might be along the lines of what is already there: deep intelligence sharing,
Yes.
assessments of China's military strength across the line of actual control, information sharing, and obviously India is equipped with American weaponry, so perhaps to keep those supply lines open, etc., etc. Would you suggest
Yes.
that word intervention may not actually mean American boots on the ground, but it might actually
Yes.
mean more of that,
Yes, absolutely. More support, intelligence sharing. Already we have that happening. It'll get more, the relationship will become even closer as far as that goes. And to counter China's aggressive stance across the line of control, yes, that cooperation, collaboration will increase, definitely. Definitely.
Andrew Leung, the concern for many people in many countries, India, Australia, certainly Japan, and the United States as well, is why is China seeking to be so expansionist? China is a booming economy. There's so much going for China. Why does it necessarily need to come at the cost of other nations who want their own space?
You're putting the United States at the end of your list. In fact, it is all about the United States as far as China is concerned. China doesn't want to make India its enemy. If you look at what China's doing, and then look at the current two sessions and China's national imperative, it's about China's growth. It's about China's advancement and to realize the China dream, and China must be allowed to grow. But then, unfortunately, China's growth is seen by the United States as threatening Americans' hegemony, and both economically and also militarily. And what China's been doing in the South China Sea and then developing its navy is to safeguard its own national interests. It's by no means India. So I think that for the India and even Australia, thinking that China's aggression is against them is getting the wrong end of the stick. Well, no doubt that China is now developing the navy rather rapidly, and of course with the island building in the South China Sea, militarizing some of these islands is in response to the first island chain and the second island chain surrounding China for a long, long time. The first island chain based in Okinawa, the second island chain based in Guam, with a lot of American assets. If you were in China, you'd be worried with all these naval forces and military assets around your doorstep. And that's what China's been doing. It's not trying to make an enemy of India or Australia. And what is India and Australia? It's no threat to China. China's economy is much, much bigger than India and Australia. And China's strength is not in the military. So do the American kind of rhetoric, always focusing on the military. China's strength is not in the military. It's international connectivity. The whole world, economically,
sure.
trade,
I'll come back
also.
to Mr. Leung, I'll come back to you in a moment. I will come back to you in a moment. Alexei Muraviev, why then does Australia need to now acquire nuclear attack submarines? What is the threat that Australia perceives from a growing Chinese maritime presence?
Look, I mean, we cannot ignore Chinese continuous expansion of its capabilities. We cannot ignore the fact that China is expanding its influence and in fact asserts its presence on our doorstep. For us, just like for India, I take the maritime domain, the sea, the world ocean is a lifeline. Our sovereignty, our national survival, the prosperity of our economy is dependent on uninterrupted sea lines of communication, on a secured global supply chain based on critical maritime links. And obviously, being a massive country with a relatively small population and a relatively small defense forces, we obviously have to think strategically in terms of investing in surgical capabilities that would give us the edge. We cannot win by numbers, but we can win by technology. Hence provides the answer of why submarines have been so critical to the qualitative enhancement of our capability. And again, we're talking at this point in time 5 nuclear-powered submarines versus how many China has. So I think all we do is contribute surgical lift and offer our capacity to our allies and partners and also ensure that our connection with the rest of the world, with East Asia, with Indian Ocean, remain uninterrupted.
Ambassador Seth, maybe about 10 to 15 years back, there was a sense of wariness, even in Australia, about India's growth as a maritime power, the evolution of the growth of the Indian Navy. That's now changed to a situation where, you know, you've got the Malabar exercises, which are essentially Indian exercises, with an American partner initially, then the Japanese came on, and of course the Australians as well. Those Malabar exercises are now going to be held off the coast of Australia, off the coast of Perth, for the first time in August. What is the significance of that?
These are held for collaboration, of course, but interoperability and strategizing and how, and these war games are sort of, as you know, they are about how to counter any strategic threat, and it's like practicing and being in an actual war. And as previous speakers have also said, the China threat is very real. It is definitely a threat to Australia, and it is also a threat to other countries in that entire region. And that is why one of the main reasons the Quad has been formed on the basis of economic cooperation and defense security, but it will eventually may have to even go into further further defense collaboration. And AUKUS, of course, has been formed for the very specific purpose as a defense, multilateral organization to counter the threat in the Indo-Pacific and to maintain the sea lines of communication in the South China Sea and in the Indo-Pacific, and to maintain peace there and to prevent. And to China, we have been seeing how it has taken up so many small islands, has made an artificial island there. Spratlys, it has claimed many other islands in the area. And it is definitely a threat to all the countries in the region. And these Malabar exercises will further strengthen the collaboration between all the navies, the 4 navies, US, Australia, and Japan and India.
Sure. And
will be able to send a clear message, I think, to China that, we are not individually alone, we are working together.
Mr. Leung, is China's red line ultimately Taiwan? That there is space for negotiation as far as Beijing is concerned with Australia, India, Japan, the United States as well in the Indo-Pacific area, the Indian Ocean area, which is what concerns New Delhi. But the red line is Taiwan. Is that the bottom line as far as Beijing's policy is concerned?
Definitely, Taiwan is the reddest of the red kind of red lines as far as China is concerned. But of course, as I said, the South China Sea kind of maneuvers of China is not only about Taiwan. It's also in response to the perception of being and of the American encirclement in the first island chain and the second island chain. As you mentioned, the sea line of communication is important to the rest of the world, but it's even more important to China because it's China's lifeblood, depending on international trade, energy, and so forth. So it is in China's national interest or imperative to keep the sea line of communications open. But having said that, though, Taiwan, of course, is the absolute red line. But then, of course, China's published 3 white papers on Taiwan recently, the last immediately after Nancy Pelosi's provocative visit, all stressing the importance or the preference for peaceful unification. Now, don't forget, and people say, oh, well, that's easier said than done. Don't forget where I'm sitting, Hong Kong, returned to the motherland peacefully, even though Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, in the beginning, refused to accept that. But in the end, Hong Kong was returned to the motherland peacefully. So don't rule out the possibility and the preference for China for peaceful unification with Taiwan.
Professor Chelani, I think one of the aspects of the China equation which affects New Delhi very, very clearly is China's weapons sales. China has been equipping Pakistan for a very long period of time, but they're also equipping Bangladesh, for example, with submarines. They've established a naval base in Abu Dhabi. They are deploying warships in the Indian Ocean region, saying that they are being deployed to fight pirates, which I think is, we can all see through. So therefore, is some of the arguments which have been made somewhat disingenuous. Does this not seem like out and out Chinese expansionism?
China's main arms clients are India's immediate neighbors, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. And the India-China border crisis, which has resulted from China's border aggression and stealthy land grabs, and the most recent attempt was to grab territory in Tawang on the other side of the India-China frontier. That aggression is still ongoing. That's turned the entire border between India and China into a hot frontier. That might be part of a Chinese strategy to keep India locked down, to boxed in along the land frontier, so as to open more room, more leeway for China to encroach on India's maritime domain. If that is the strategy, India has to counter it, because if China were to encroach on India's maritime domain, then India's encirclement by China would be complete. Yes. India has to stop this neglect of its naval capabilities. The Navy remains, and the Navy still gets stepmotherly treatment from the decision makers in New Delhi. This has to change, because the maritime domain has become critical to Asian and global security, even in relation to Taiwan. That's in the maritime domain. The future crises that will determine global security are going to occur at sea. And therefore, the maritime domain is increasingly important. That's the reason why it's significant that the Australian Prime Minister is visiting India, and he'll be followed very soon by the Japanese Prime Minister. India, Japan, Australia collaboration on the maritime front has become imperative in order to ensure a stable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region.
All right, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us. Lots of security concerns affecting all of these nations, somewhat differently, but there are common strands as well, and I think that strand is concern over China. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us.